I believe you attended the Bach recital in the Constant Street Hall on the 3rd of June. Did you happen to notice Lord Robert at this concert? I think I do remember his lordship was present. I pay little attention to externals when I listen to beautiful music. Did you return her bag to Mrs. Halkett Hackett? Dmitri gave a sharp cry, drew his left hand out of his pocket and stared at his fingers. 3 drops of blood fell from them. Blood on your hand, Mr. Dmitri, said Alain. I have broken my glass. He wrapped his fine silk handkerchief around his fingers and nursed them in his right hand. He was white to the lips. The sight of blood, he said, affects me unpleasantly. I must ask you to excuse me. When you've answered my last question, did you ever return Mrs. Halkett Hackett's bag? I do not understand you. We spoke of Lady Carados's bag. We speak now of Mrs. Halkett Hackett's bag, which you took from the sofa at the Sermione concert. Do you deny that you took it? I shall answer no more questions without the advice of my solicitor. That is final. He rose to his feet. So did Alain and Fox. Very well, said Alain. I shall have to see you again, Mr. Dmitri, and again, and I dare say again. Fox, will you show Mr. Dmitri down? When the door had closed, Alan spoke into his telephone. My man is leaving. He'll probably take a taxi. Who's tailing him? Anderson. Ask him to report when he gets a chance, but not to take too big a chance. It's important. Fox came in grinning. He's shaken up a fair treat to see, Mr. Alain. I've a strong feeling, Fox, that Dmitri is not working this blackmail game on his own. What's the time? 1 o'clock. I'm due at Sir Daniel's at 2. I'll have to see the AC before then. They arrived at St. Luke's Chambers, Harley Street at 2 precisely. Davidson came forward and shook hands. It's very good of you to come to me, he said. Do sit down. They sat down. Alain glanced round, a beautiful and expensive room crying in devious tones of the gratitude of wealthy patients. You very kindly rang up to say you might be able to help us, he said. Yes, said Davidson. I did. I find myself in the unenviable position of being one of the last people to see Lord Robert. When did you see him? In the hall, just before I left. I suppose it is a case of homicide. Seems to be no doubt at all. He was smothered. Smothered? Good God. Why didn't he make a rumpus? Is he marked? There are no marks of violence. None. His heart was certainly in a poor condition. I ordered him to deny himself his port and to rest for 2 hours every day. He paid no attention whatsoever. Nevertheless, it was not a condition under which I would expect an unprovoked heart attack. Struggle certainly might induce it, and you tell me there is no evidence of a struggle. He was knocked out. Knocked out, and quietly asphyxiated. How very horrible. I am longing for a precise account of those last minutes in the hall. We have the order of the going, but not the nature of it. If you don't mind giving us a microscopically exact version. A microscopically exact version. Let me present this little scene to you, as if we watched it take place behind the footlights. I've shaken hands with my host and hostess, where the double flight of stairs meet in the gallery outside the ballroom. I come down the left-hand flight of stairs. In the hall are scattered groups of people. I notice an old lady whom I wish to avoid. I dart into the men's cloakroom. The only other men in the cloakroom are obviously engaged in an extremely private conversation. Who are they? Asked Alain. Captain Withers and that pleasant youth, Donald Potter. In sheer decency, I'm forced to leave. Lucy Lorimer. Tiens, there I go. It's all right, said Alain. I know all about Lucy Lorimer. I pull up my scarf and lurk in the doorway, waiting for her to go. Dmitri stands at the foot of the stairs. A group of young people go out. Then Mrs. Halkett Hackett comes down and slips through the doors into the misty street. Somebody jostles me. It's Captain Withers, who's come out of the cloakroom. I turn to receive his apologies and find his attention is fixed on Lord Robert Gospel, who has begun to descend the stairs. Then he too thrusts his way through a party of chattering youngsters and goes out. Before I've taken 3 steps, young Donald Potter comes out of the buffet with Bridget O'Brien. Donald Potter says what is no doubt a word of farewell to Bridget, and then he too goes out by the front entrance. Without speaking to his uncle? Yes. And Lord Robert is asking in that very penetrating voice of his if Dmitri has seen Mrs. Halkett Hackett, the last thing I see or hear before the doors close behind me. That was a very vivid little scene, said Alain. When you got outside the house, did you see any of the others, or had they all gone? The party of young people came out as I did. To my horror, I saw a Rolls-Royce on the other side of the road. The window was down, and there was Lucy Lorimer. Sir Daniel, nothing for it but to cross the road. Sir Daniel, I've waited for you. Something most important. I shall drive you home, and on the way I can tell you. I think furiously, and by the time I reach her window I am prepared. Lady Lorimer, forgive me, not a moment to spare. The Prime Minister, a sudden indisposition. And while she still gapes, I turn and bolt like a rabbit into the mist. For the first time since the tragedy, Alain laughed. Davidson went on. I ran, pursued by that voice, offering, no doubt, to drive me like the wind to Downing Street. Mercifully, the mist thickened. I shrank into the shadows. The Rolls-Royce passed. I crept out. At last, a taxi. It was coming behind me. Then voices, but indistinguishable. The taxi stopped, came on towards me, engaged. I walked on. I walked from Belgrave Square to Cadogan Gardens, and I assure you, my dear Mr. Alain, I felt like a middle-aged harlequin in search of adventure. Which way did you turn when you fled from Lady Lorimer? To my right. How far had you run when you heard the taxi? Perhaps 400 yards? You tell us you heard voices. Did you recognize them? I thought at first that one was a woman's voice, and then I thought it was a man's. It was a high-pitched voice. And the other? Definitely a man's. Sir Daniel, did you happen to see the caterer, Dmitri, return her bag to Lady Carados? I don't think so. I noticed that bag. It has a very lovely emerald and ruby clasp, an old Italian setting, and much too choice a piece to bedizen a bit of tinsel nonsense. But nowadays people have no sense of congruity in ornament. I saw in a room at Marsden House last night a Cellini medallion. And to what base use do you imagine it had been put? I've no idea, said Alain, smiling. It had been sunk in a machine-turned gold case with a diamond clasp, and it was surrounded with brilliants. This sacrilegious abortion was intended as a receptacle for cigarettes. Where was this horror? In an otherwise charming green sitting room on the top landing. When did you visit this room? It must have been about 11:30. I had an urgent case yesterday, and the assistant surgeon rang me up to report. You didn't go there again? No. Speaking of cigarettes, what sort of case did you carry last night? Davidson's eyes bored into his. Knocked out, you said. Yes, I see. On the temple. That's it, said Alain. Davidson pulled the flat silver case from his pocket. It was beautifully made with a sliding action and beveled edges. He handed it to Alain. One could strike a sharp blow with it? One could, said Alain. But it's got traces of plate powder in the tooling, and it's not the right kind, I fancy. Suppose the murderer had some slight knowledge of medicine and was aware of Lord Robert's condition. Would he be likely to realize how little time he needed? I should say that any first-year student would probably realize that a diseased heart would give out very rapidly under these conditions. A nurse would know. Indeed, I should have thought most laymen would think it probable. The actual time to within 2 or 3 minutes might not be appreciated. Yes, thank you. Alain got up. I think that's everything. We'll get out a statement for you to sign, if you will. I know it's difficult for you to speak of your patients under these extremely disagreeable circumstances. We'll word the beastly document as discreetly as may be. I'm sure you will, Mr. Alain. They shook hands, and Fox and Alain went out. Where do we go now? Asked Fox. I think we'd better take a look at Marsden House. Alain and Fox stood in the green boudoir at Marsden House and looked at the telephone. He must have sat in this chair facing the door, said Alain. He wouldn't have seen anybody coming because of that very charming screen. Where's the offensive Cellini conversion, I wonder? Not here. Francois might have noticed it when he was doing the ashtrays. Better ask him. He rang Francois, who knew nothing of any stray cigarette case. Alain sighed. All right, our job is to find out if anyone else could have come upstairs, listened to the telephone, and gone down again while Francois was in the servants' quarters. Come on, Fox, let's prowl. The lavatory turned out to be a Victorian affair with a small anteroom and a general air of gloom. The inner door was half-panelled with clouded glass. Beyond it was a bedroom that had been used as a lady's cloakroom, and at the top of the stairs the second sitting-out room. Beside the door of this room was another green baize door leading to servants' quarters and back stairs. The other side of the gallery was open, and Alain leant on the balustrade and stared down into the hall 2 stories below. "A good vantage spot, this," he said. "We'll go down now." On the next landing was the ballroom. Alain and Fox hunted about but found nothing to help them and went down to the hall. They went into the buffet. "Look, Fox, here's a Sherlock Holmes touch. A cigar stump lying by a long trace of its own ash. And here's the gentleman's glass beside it, and here, on the floor, is the broken band. A Corona. Alain sniffed at the glass. Brandy. "Fox, ring up Dimitri and find out if Carados drank brandy and smoked a cigar after the party, and you might ask if we can see the Carados family in about half an hour. Then see if General and Mrs. Halkett Hackett will see us in about 2 hours." Fox padded off, and Alain went through the second door of the buffet into a back passage. Here he found the butler's pantry. He rejoined Fox in the hall. "Mr. Dimitri," said Fox, "remembered giving Sir Herbert Carados brandy from a special bottle reserved for him." "We'd better print the brandy glass," said Alain. "How did you get on?" "The Halkett Hacketts will see us any time this afternoon, and Sir Herbert will see us if we go round now. He mentioned that he is a great personal friend of the Chief Commissioner." "Oh, Lord, huff and grandeur. Out with the best butter and lay it on in slabs." A footman showed Alain and Fox into a library. Moments later Sir Herbert came in, limping rather more perceptibly than usual, and employing a black stick. He screwed his glass in his eye and said, "Mr. Alain?" Alain stepped forward and bowed. "It is extremely kind of you to see us, sir," he said. No, said Carados. "One must do one's duty, however hard one is hit. I was talking to your Chief Commissioner just now, Mr. Alain. He happens to be a very old friend of mine. Would you sit down, both of you? Mr. This is Inspector Fox, sir." "Oh, yes," said Carados, extending his hand. "Do sit down, Fox." He turned again to Alain. "Your mother sees quite a lot of my wife, I believe. She was at Marston House last night." Alain said, "We are very sorry indeed, sir, to bother you after what has happened. I will be as quick as I can. I wanted first of all to ask you if you spoke to Lord Robert last night. I thought that if there was anything at all unusual in his manner it would not escape your notice, as it would the notice of, I am afraid, the majority of people." Carados looked slightly less huffy. "As a soldier man, I've had to use my eyes a bit, and I think if there's anything wrong anywhere, I'm not likely to miss it. I spoke to Lord Robert Gospel once or twice last night, and he was perfectly normal." Alain fixed Carados with a reverent glare. "Sir Herbert," he said, "I'm going to do a very unconventional thing, and I hope you won't get me my dismissal, as I'm sure you very easily could. I'm going to take you wholly into our confidence." Up came his head. The knees were spread apart, the hands went involuntarily to the inside of the thighs. A wise son of empire sat confessed. "It would not be the first time," said Carados modestly, "that confidence has been reposed in me." "I'm sure it wouldn't. This is our difficulty. We have reason to believe that the key to this mystery lies in a single sentence spoken by Lord Robert on the telephone from Marston House. If we could get a true report of the conversation that Lord Robert held with an unknown person at 1 o'clock this morning, I believe we would have gone a long way towards making an arrest. I've spoken to the servant on duty on the top landing, and he fancies he can remember that you came upstairs around about that time." "By God, I should think the fellow did remember, confound his impudence. No matches in the sitting-out room at the head of the stairs, and the damn place smothered in ash. I sent him herring off with a flea in his ear." "Were you on the landing all this time, sir?" "Of course I wasn't. I was in and out of the blasted sitting-room. I went upstairs about 5 to 1, walked into this room, and found it in the condition I've described. I would have looked at the other room, the one with the telephone, but I saw there was a couple sitting out in there. Behaving, I may say, more like a footman and a housemaid than the sort of people one is accustomed to receive as one's guests. The man came sneaking out just as I was blasting this damned waiter fellow. Hung about the landing. Withers. Then the lady came out and scuttled into the cloakroom. Yes, by God, sir, and Robert Gospel came upstairs and went into the telephone room." Carados blew out his moustache triumphantly. "There you are," he said. Into the room to telephone. Splendid, sir. Now, may I just go over this? You came out of the first sitting room and spoke to the waiter. Captain Withers came out of the telephone room, followed in a moment by Mrs. Halkett Hackett. Here! I didn't mention the lady's name, Alain. By God, I hope I know my manners better than to use a lady's name out of turn. Alain achieved an expression of gentlemanly cunning. I'm afraid, sir, I rather jumped to conclusions. You mean it's common talk? Well. Sorry to hear that. Halkett Hackett's a very old friend of mine. Sorry to hear that. Very sorry to hear it. Alain reflected acidly that Sir Herbert was enjoying himself thoroughly, and hurried on. At this moment, just as Mrs. Halkett Hackett dives into the cloakroom, Lord Robert comes upstairs. What does Withers do? Shears off and comes sloping into the sitting-room after me. I had to make conversation with the fella. Young Potter was sulking in there, too. Did you by any chance notice a Miss Harris while you were upstairs? Do you mean my wife's secretary? Yes. She bolted into the lavatory when I came up. Didn't see her come out. I see. Perhaps I might have a word with her before I go. Certainly. Now, continued Alain, about the end of the ball, we would like to trace Lord Robert's movements. Well, my wife and I stood on the ballroom gallery saying goodbye to our guests. Lord Robert went downstairs into the cloakroom and out again wearing that extraordinary cloak of his. I came down, past him. I went into the buffet. Did you come out again before Lord Robert left? No. Carados returned for a moment to the stricken soldier-man. No. That was the last I shall ever see of Robert Gospel. Oh, well. I stayed in the buffet for some time. I smoked a cigar, had a peg of brandy. Had a word with that fellow Dimitri, and then I went home. With Lady Carados and Miss O'Brien? What? No. I packed them off earlier. I wanted to have a look round, make sure everything was all right. Chauffeur came back for me. Anything else? If I might have a word with Lady Carados, sir? I don't think my wife can give you any information, Alain. She's absolutely prostrated. If I were to disturb her, which I have no intention of doing as she is asleep in bed, she would refuse, that's definite. The door opened and a footman came in. Her ladyship, sir, wishes me to say that if Mr. Alain has a few minutes to spare, she would be very pleased to see him. Lady Carados was in her boudoir, erect in a tall blue chair. She held out her hands when she saw Alain. Roderick, what do you want to ask me? The green sitting-room with the telephone. We know that Bunchy used the telephone and are anxious to find out if he was overheard. Someone says you left your bag there, Evelyn, did you? Yes. Dimitri returned it to you? Yes. When was this? About 12:30 or 1:15. Not as late as 1 o'clock? No. Why are you so certain of this? Because, said Lady Carados, I was watching the time rather carefully. The door opened and Bridget came in. She looked as if she'd been crying. Oh, Donna, she said, I'm sorry, I didn't know. This is my girl, Roderick. Bridget, this is Sarah's uncle. How do you do? Said Bridget. The detective one. The detective one. Perhaps you could help us. We were talking about your mother's bag. The one she left upstairs and that I found. You returned the bag, did you? Yes, Bridget said, and it was simply squashed full of money. But why the bag? Does it fit somewhere frightfully subtle? Lady Carados said, Bridget, darling, I'm by way of talking privately to Mr. Alain. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll whiz off. Shall I see you again before you go, Mr. Alain? Please. Well, come along to the old nursery, I'll be there. Bridget went out and Lady Carados covered her face with her hands. Don't try to tell me, Evelyn, said Alain gently. I'll see if I can tell you. Listen, someone has been blackmailing you. You've had letters written in script on Woolworth paper. One of them came on the morning Bunchy brought you flowers. Last night you left your bag in the green room because you had been told to leave it there. It contained the money the blackmailer demanded. Bridget returned your bag still full of notes while you were in the supper room with Bunchy. You replaced it in the green sitting room, and later it was returned to you empty. When Bridget brought back that hideous bag last night, I nearly collapsed. There had been other letters. I destroyed them and tried to put them out of my mind. But this one threatened dreadful things that would hurt Bridget so much. I put £500 in notes in the bag and left it on the little table in the green sitting room before 1 o'clock.
and then Bridgie must have seen it. I shall never forget her coming into the supper room, laughing and holding out that bag. Somehow we got rid of Bridgie. Sir Daniel Davidson was there. I got rid of him too, and then Bunchy said he knew what I wanted to do with my bag and begged me not to do it. I broke away from him and went back to the green sitting room. It was then 20-1. I put the bag behind a big ormolu and enamel box on the table. Then I went down to the ballroom. I don't know how much later it was when I saw Dmitri coming through the room with the bag, and when I took it, I knew the money had gone.
Evelyn, is it possible that Dmitri is the man who is blackmailing you?
Good heavens, no.
Are you sure? He's in and out of people's houses and has free access to their rooms.
How long has he been doing this work?
He told me 7 years.
My secret is more than twice as old as that.
You realize, don't you, that you are not the only victim? Bunchy was actually working with us on information we had from another source, but which points directly to the same individual. It seems probable that the blackmailing may be linked with the murder, so we have a double incentive to get at the blackmailer's identity. Now then, it's something about Bridget, isn't it? And it happened more than 14 years ago. Ought we to begin with your first husband?
You needn't go on being delicate, Roderick. I think you've guessed.
Paddy and I were not married.
Bless my soul, said Alain.
How very courageous of you, Evelyn.
I think it was now, but it didn't seem so then. Paddy left a wife in an Australian lunatic asylum, came home, and fell in love with me. We went through a form of marriage and lived happily and bigamously together. Then Paddy died.
Weren't you afraid it would come out?
No. Paddy's wife had no relations. She was a music hall comedienne who had been left stranded in a little town in New South Wales. He married her there and took her to Sydney. 6 weeks later she became hopelessly insane. Paddy had not told anybody of his marriage, and he had not looked up any of his acquaintances in Sydney. When he arranged to have her put away, it was under her maiden name. He invested a sum of money, the interest on which was enough to pay the fees and expenses. He left the whole thing in the hands of the only man who knew the truth, Anthony Banks, his greatest friend. He lived in Sydney and held Paddy's power of attorney.
The even voice faltered for a moment.
5 months after we were married, Paddy was killed. I had started Bridgie and came up to London to see my doctor. Paddy was to motor up from our house at Ripplecott and drive me back. In the morning I had a telegram from him. It said, "The best possible news from Anthony Banks." On the way the car skidded and crashed in a little village. He was taken into the vicarage and then to the cottage hospital. When I got there he was unconscious, and he didn't know that I was with him when he died.
And the news?
I felt certain that it could only be one thing. His wife must have died. But we could find no letters or cables, so he must have destroyed whatever message he had been sent by Anthony Banks. The next thing that happened was that Paddy's solicitor received £5,000 from Australia and a letter from Anthony Banks to say it was forwarded in accordance with Paddy's instructions. In the meantime, I had written to Anthony Banks. I told him of Paddy's death, but wrote as a cousin of Paddy's. He replied saying nothing about Paddy's wife, but he did say that a letter from him must have reached Paddy just before he died, and that if it had been found he would like it to be destroyed unopened. Anthony Banks must have been honest, because he could have kept that £5,000 for himself when she died, and he didn't know Paddy had remarried.
Do you remember the name of the people at the vicarage?
I don't.
At the cottage hospital?
It was at Falconbridge in Buckinghamshire. Dr. Bletherley was an elderly man with a face like a sheep, and the nurses were charming.
She looked steadily at Alain.
"You can see now," she said, "why I would go almost to any length to keep this from Bridget."
"Yes," said Alain, "I can see." Alain saw Bridget in our old nursery, which had been converted into a very human sitting room. "I want to talk to you about last night, if I may. You knew Lord Robert pretty well, didn't you?"
"Yes. He was a great friend of Donna's." "I suppose you think I'm being hard and modern about him. I'd have been sorrier if it had happened longer ago. Doesn't mean I'm not sorry, I am. We all loved him. But I found out I didn't really know him well. He was harder than you'd ever believe. But I feel I'd give anything to be able to tell him I'm sorry.
Sorry for what?
For not being nicer to him last night. I snubbed him because he was so beastly to his nephew, who happens to be rather a particular friend of mine.
Yes, I know about that. Don't you think it's possible that Donald was rather hard on his uncle?
No, I don't. Donald's a man now. He's got to stand on his own feet and decide things for himself. Bunchy simply wouldn't understand that.
Do you like Captain Withers? Asked Alain suddenly.
What?
Bridget became rather pink.
I can't say he's exactly my cup of tea, but he's a marvellous dancer, and Donald said Witz is a terribly good businessman. He's been frightfully nice about advising Donald, and he knows all sorts of people who could be useful.
Useful in what way?
Donald is going in for medicine, isn't he? Well, Bridget hesitated. That was the original idea, but Witz rather advises him not to. They've thought of starting a new nightclub. Witz has got wonderfully original ideas.
Yes, I can quite imagine it. He's doing quite well with the place at Leatherhead, isn't he? Why doesn't he take Donald in there?
Bridget looked surprised. How did you know about that? She asked. Well, Donald says it's just a small men's club, more for fun than to make money.
Have you spoken to Donald since his uncle died?
Bridget clenched her hands and thumped them angrily on her knees. He rang me up. I just got to the telephone when Bart came in, took the receiver from me. He sympathised with Donald, and then he said, "If you don't mind, an old fellow, I think it would be better if you didn't communicate with my stepdaughter for the time being and put the receiver down." I stormed at him, but we were in Donna's room, and she was so upset I had to promise I wouldn't write or anything. It's so beastly unfair, and it's all because Bart's afraid of all the reporters and scandal. And if he thinks I'm going to give Donald up, he's jolly well got another thing coming.
You engaged?
No. We're waiting till Donald begins to earn.
And how much must Donald earn before he is marriageable?
You don't put it very nicely, do you? I suppose you think I'm hard and modern and beastly.
Donald is his uncle's heir, you know.
Don't you dare, she said, her eyes flashing. And don't you go putting ideas into people's heads by getting on the defensive before you've been given cause, said Alain, very firmly indeed.
Now then, 3 or 4 official questions, if you please. Did you sit out in the green sitting room on the top gallery between 12 and 1?
I was up there with Donald until after most people had gone into the supper room. We both came down together. That was when I returned her bag to Donna. Donna asked me to fetch her smelling salts. I ran upstairs to the ladies' cloakroom. Donna's maid Sophie was there. I got the smelling salts from Sophie, ran downstairs. I couldn't find Donna, but I ran into Bunchy, who said she was all right again.
Did you go up to the green sitting room again?
Donald and I went up towards the end of the party. Did you at any stage of the proceedings leave your cigarette case in that room? Bridget stared at him. I haven't got a cigarette case. I don't smoke.
Do you know if anybody overheard Bunchy telephone from that room at about 1 o'clock?
I haven't heard of it. Have you asked Miss Harris? She was on the top landing a good deal last night.
I'll have a word with her. That's all then, he said. Thank you so much, Miss Bridget. You take care of your mother, who needs you rather badly just now. Encourage your young man to renew his studies, and if you can, wean him from Withers. Goodbye now. I'm off. Miss Harris was neither plain nor beautiful, short nor tall, dark nor fair. No wonder that few people had noticed her at Marston House. She was not in the least nervous. May we have your name and address?
Certainly, Mr. Alain. Dorothea Violet Harris. Address, town or country?
Both, please.
Town, 57 Ebury Mews, SW. Country, the Rectory, Barbican Bramley, Bucks.
Now, Miss Harris, I wonder if you can give me any help in this business. To his intense astonishment, Miss Harris opened her pad she had brought with her, and he could see a column of shorthand hieroglyphics. She cleared her throat.
At about 12:30, she began, I met Lord Robert Gospel in the hall. I was speaking to Miss O'Brien. He asked me to dance with him later in the evening. I remained in the hall until 1:45. I happened to glance at my watch. I then went upstairs to top landing, remained there, and went down to ballroom landing before 1:30. Lord Robert Gospel then asked me to dance. We danced. 3 successive dances with repeats. Lord Robert introduced me to several of his friends, and then he took me into the buffet. We drank champagne.